January 17, 1991, 2:51 a.m. local time. Baghdad, Iraq. Major Hatem Abdul Razak sat at his radar console in the Iraqi Air Defense Command Center, watching hundreds of aircraft signatures approaching from Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf. The coalition air war had begun. His Soviet-designed P-14 Tall King early warning radar showed the expected picture: massive formations of American and Allied aircraft preparing to strike Iraqi targets. The defensive plan was ready. 60 SAM batteries stood on alert. Over 3,000 anti-aircraft guns covered the skies. Fighter interceptors waited at airfields across Iraq. The Americans would pay heavily for attacking Baghdad. At 2:51 a.m. exactly, the first explosions erupted across Baghdad. The Ministry of Defense Telecommunications Center vanished in a fireball. 3 seconds later, the Air Defense Command backup facility exploded. Then, the Presidential Palace compound. Then, Air Defense Sector headquarters. 6 targets destroyed in 8 seconds. Major Razak stared at his radar screen in confusion. The aircraft signatures he'd been tracking were still 80 miles away, too far to have launched missiles or dropped bombs. But the explosions were happening now, in downtown Baghdad, at precisely the targets the defense plan had identified as most critical. "Where are they?" Razak shouted to his supervisor. "Why can't we see them?" The supervisor ran to the radar display, thinking the equipment had malfunctioned, but the radar was functioning perfectly. It showed exactly what it was designed to show: the massive coalition strike package approaching from the south and east. What it didn't show were the 10 F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters already over Baghdad, bombing the city's most critical military facilities with complete impunity, while remaining invisible to every radar system the Iraqis possessed. For the Soviet Union and its client states, air defense in 1991 represented the culmination of 40 years of technological development and doctrinal refinement. The Warsaw Pact integrated air defense system was considered the most sophisticated in the world, a layered defensive network designed to detect, track, and destroy any aircraft attempting to penetrate Soviet airspace. The doctrine was proven through decades of successful operations and had evolved into a comprehensive system that Soviet military theorists believed was essentially impenetrable. The foundation was early warning radar. Long-range systems like the P-14 Tall King could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 150 miles, providing ample time to activate defenses and scramble interceptors. Once detected, aircraft were tracked by acquisition radars and fire control systems that guided surface-to-air missiles to intercept them. The SAM belts, multiple overlapping zones of SA-2 Guideline, SA-3 Goa, SA-6 Gainful, and SA-8 Gecko missiles, created defensive barriers that aircraft couldn't penetrate without accepting catastrophic losses. Fighter interceptors provided mobile defense against aircraft that evaded or survived the SAM zones. The system had demonstrated effectiveness in actual combat. On May 1, 1960, a Soviet SA-2 missile shot down Francis Gary Powers' U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Sverdlovsk, proving that even the highest-flying American aircraft could be destroyed. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egyptian and Syrian SA-6 missiles destroyed dozens of Israeli aircraft in the war's opening days, demonstrating that modern Soviet air defenses could defeat even the Israeli Air Force, considered among the world's best. Soviet doctrine held that layered radar coverage combined with integrated air defenses made successful penetration strikes essentially impossible. Iraq had purchased and deployed Soviet air defense systems extensively during the 1980s, building defensive networks that protected major cities and military installations. By 1991, Baghdad was the most heavily defended city in the world, more densely protected than Moscow itself. Over 3,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces ranging from 23mm to 130mm covered the skies. 60 SAM batteries included SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, and SA-8 Soviet systems, plus French-made Roland missiles. Fire control radars provided targeting data to missile batteries. Early warning radars gave advance notice of approaching threats. The defensive plan assumed that any aircraft attempting to strike Baghdad would face a storm of fire that would destroy or drive off the attackers before they could damage critical targets. Iraqi air defense commanders, trained by Soviet advisors and equipped with Soviet systems, were confident in their capabilities. They had studied American tactics, knew the types of aircraft the coalition possessed, and believed their defenses could inflict casualties high enough to make continued strikes politically unsustainable for Western democracies. The Americans might have technological advantages, but numbers and defensive depth would prevail. Coalition aircraft would pay a heavy price for strikes on Baghdad. What neither Iraqi nor Soviet air defense planners knew was that American engineers had spent 14 years developing technology specifically designed to render radar-based air defenses obsolete. The F-117 Nighthawk, developed in absolute secrecy by Lockheed's Skunk Works division from 1977 to 1983, represented a revolutionary approach to aircraft design where every element was optimized for a single purpose: invisibility to radar. The program began as Have Blue, an experimental project led by Ben Rich after Kelly Johnson's retirement from Skunk Works. The challenge was creating an aircraft with radar cross-sections so low that defensive radars couldn't detect it at useful ranges. Conventional aircraft design used curves and smooth surfaces for aerodynamic efficiency. These curves reflected radar energy back toward the transmitter, creating strong radar returns. The Have Blue solution was radical. Eliminate all curves. Design the aircraft entirely from flat panels arranged at precise angles, calculated to deflect radar energy away from the transmitter rather than reflecting it back. The result looked like something from science fiction. The F-117 consisted entirely of flat faceted surfaces arranged in angles determined by computer calculations. The fuselage was a collection of flat triangular and trapezoidal panels. The wings had no curves, just straight leading and trailing edges meeting at sharp angles. Even the cockpit windows were covered with mesh that maintained the flat angular surfaces. Nothing about the design was optimized for aerodynamics. Everything was optimized for radar deflection, but geometry alone wasn't sufficient. The aircraft's surfaces were coated with radar-absorbing materials, special paints, and composite coatings that absorbed radio energy rather than reflecting it. The exact composition remained classified, but the materials contained carbon and other elements that converted radar energy into heat, dissipating it rather than returning it to the receiver. Every surface, every panel, every access door received RAM treatment to minimize radar return. The engines, two General Electric F-404 turbofans producing 10,800 pounds of thrust each, were buried deep in the fuselage. The intakes were covered with mesh screens that allowed air to enter but prevented radar energy from reflecting off the engine fan blades. The exhaust was mixed with cool bypass air and flattened into wide slits rather than circular nozzles, reducing infrared signature and making heat-seeking missiles less effective. Every element that might reflect radar or emit detectable energy was minimized or eliminated. The resulting radar cross-section was extraordinary. Conventional fighter aircraft like the F-15 or Soviet MiG-29 had RCS values between 10 and 100 square meters, large enough to be detected by air defense radars at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The F-117's RCS measured approximately 0.03 square meters, roughly equivalent to a golf ball. This thousand-fold reduction in radar signature meant that defensive radars designed to detect normal aircraft at 150 miles might detect an F-117 at perhaps 5 to 10 miles, too late for effective engagement. The trade-off for invisibility was performance. The angular faceted design made the F-117 aerodynamically unstable and relatively slow. Maximum speed was high subsonic, around 600 miles per hour. The aircraft required constant computer-controlled flight corrections to maintain stable flight. Without the fly-by-wire system, the F-117 would be unflyable. Range was limited to about 600 miles without refueling. The aircraft carried no radar. Using radar would announce its position. Navigation relied on infrared sensors and the then-new GPS satellite navigation system. The only weapon was laser-guided bombs dropped from an internal bay. The aircraft couldn't defend itself and couldn't engage air-to-air targets. But none of these limitations mattered for the F-117's intended mission. Penetrating heavily defended airspace undetected and destroying high-value targets with precision weapons. The first F-117 flew on June 18, 1981. The aircraft became operational in October 1983. For 5 years, the program remained completely secret. F-117s were based at Tonopah Test Range in Nevada, flown only at night, and hidden from Soviet satellites during daylight hours. Pilots were forbidden from discussing their aircraft even with family members. The American public didn't know the F-117 existed until November 1988, when the Air Force released a single grainy photograph showing the aircraft's angular silhouette. Even after public revelation, the F-117's full capabilities remained classified. Soviet intelligence knew the Americans had developed some kind of low observable aircraft, but the actual radar cross-section values and operational tactics remained unknown. Soviet military analysts studying publicly available information concluded that while American stealth technology probably reduced radar signature significantly, it couldn't eliminate detection entirely. Soviet air defense doctrine, built on decades of radar development and successful combat operations, would adapt to the challenge. The F-117's first combat mission came in December 1989 during Operation Just Cause in Panama, where 2 aircraft bombed a Panamanian Defense Force barracks. The mission was partially successful. 1 bomb missed its target, but proved the aircraft could operate in combat. By August 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the Air Force had 42 operational F-117s assigned to the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing at Tonopah. When Operation Desert Storm planning began, mission planners immediately recognized that F-117s were the only aircraft capable of striking heavily defended targets in downtown Baghdad with acceptable risk. In January 1991, 42 F-117s deployed to Khamis Musait Air Base in Saudi Arabia. The initial mission plan called for using F-117s to destroy individual tanks and armored vehicles on tank plinking, using precision laser-guided bombs. This plan was quickly revised. F-117s were too valuable and too limited in numbers to waste on individual vehicles that conventional aircraft could destroy. Instead, the stealth fighters received the most critical strategic targets: communications centers, command bunkers, air defense headquarters, leadership facilities in downtown Baghdad, and other heavily defended locations. At 2:51 a.m. on January 17th, 10 F-117s reached Baghdad after a 4-hour flight from Saudi Arabia. Each aircraft carried 2 2,000-pound GBU-27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bombs. The pilots had memorized their target locations and attack profiles. Radio silence was absolute. No communications that might reveal their presence. The aircraft approached from different directions at altitudes between 15,000 and 20,000 feet, high enough to avoid most anti-aircraft artillery, but well within range of SAM systems if those systems could detect and track them. Iraqi radar operators saw nothing. The P-14 and other early warning radars that could detect conventional aircraft at 150-plus miles showed empty sky over Baghdad, even as F-117s orbited overhead selecting targets. Fire control radars that should have locked onto approaching threats registered nothing. SAM battery crews waited for targeting data that never arrived because their radars couldn't see the aircraft they were designed to detect. At precisely 2:51 a.m., the first F-117 released its bombs. The pilot illuminated the target, the Ministry of Defense Telecommunications Center, with his infrared laser designator. The GBU-27's laser seeker detected the reflected laser energy and guided the bomb to impact with accuracy measured in feet. The building's roof collapsed as 2,000 pounds of high explosive detonated inside. 3 seconds later, another F-117 destroyed the Air Defense Command backup facility 3 miles away. Then the Presidential Palace compound, then Sector Air Defense Headquarters. Within 10 minutes, 10 F-117s had destroyed 20 of Baghdad's most critical military targets. The Iraqi response was panic and confusion. Major Razak and his fellow air defense officers could see the explosions, but couldn't see the aircraft causing them. They alerted SAM batteries to fire on anything they detected, but the radars detected nothing. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire in barrage mode, filling the sky with shells in hopes of hitting something through sheer volume of fire. Thousands of tracer rounds arced into the night sky. SAM missiles launched vertically, their crews hoping the missiles' own seekers would find targets that ground radars couldn't detect. None of this mattered. The F-117s flew through the barrage, completely unaffected, invisible to the systems trying desperately to locate them. Captain Marcel Kerdavid, flying one of the F-117s that night, later described the experience. "We could see SAMs launching from the ground, these white plumes going up. They'd arc away from us, sometimes toward us, but always missing by hundreds of yards. The Iraqis were firing blind. They had no idea where we were. We could see their anti-aircraft fire creating patterns in the sky, but none of it was directed at us specifically. It was like they were trying to fill the entire sky with metal, hoping to hit something by chance." The second night of the war followed the same pattern. F-117s struck Republican Guard headquarters, destroying the command structure for Iraq's elite forces. Scud missile sites vanished under precision strikes. Communication nodes went offline. Air defense radars that activated to search for coalition aircraft were destroyed by missiles specifically designed to home on radar emissions. The few radars that remained active showed nothing where F-117s operated. Iraqi air defense commanders, trained in Soviet doctrine that depended absolutely on radar detection and tracking, had no procedures for engaging aircraft they couldn't see. Over 43 days of combat operations, the pattern never changed. F-117s flew 1,271 sorties against Iraqi targets. They dropped over 2,000 tons of laser-guided bombs. They destroyed approximately 40% of all strategic targets struck during the war. Command centers, communication facilities, bunkers, bridges, airfields, and leadership sites. They did this while representing only 2.5% of coalition aircraft deployed. And they did it without a single aircraft lost, damaged, or even hit by enemy fire. Iraqi gunners fired over 3,000 SAM missiles during Desert Storm. None hit an F-117. Most hit nothing at all. The Baghdad missions became what pilots called milk runs, routine flights with minimal danger. F-117s returned to the same targets multiple nights because Iraqi defenses never adapted. The aircraft would fly to Baghdad, orbit overhead selecting targets, drop their bombs with precision, and fly home through defensive fire that couldn't find them. Iraqi air defense crews knew the aircraft were coming. They could hear the jet engines and see the explosions, but they couldn't engage what they couldn't detect. Iraqi attempts to counter the stealth aircraft were ineffective and costly. Anti-aircraft artillery switched to barrage fire mode, firing thousands of shells into the sky in hopes of randomly hitting an aircraft. This consumed enormous quantities of ammunition without achieving results. SAM batteries launched missiles at engine sounds or areas where explosions occurred, but without radar guidance, the missiles flew ballistically and missed their targets by miles. Some commanders ordered their radars turned off, believing the Americans were homing on radar emissions. This didn't help. The F-117s used infrared and GPS navigation, not radar homing, and only made Iraqi air defenses less effective against conventional coalition aircraft. Soviet air defense doctrine, refined over 40 years and proven in multiple conflicts, had no answer for aircraft it couldn't detect. The entire system was built on the assumption that radar would provide early warning and tracking data that enabled SAM engagement and fighter intercept. Remove radar detection, and the entire defensive structure collapsed. Iraqi defenders could see F-117s visually if the aircraft flew directly overhead at low altitude, but visual detection at night from ground level provided perhaps 5 to 10 seconds warning. Nowhere near enough time to aim and fire weapons effectively. By the time gunners identified an aircraft visually, aimed their weapons and fired, the F-117 was gone. The technology gap was comprehensive and unbridgeable with Soviet technology. Soviet radar development had focused on increasing power, improving range, and enhancing resolution to detect smaller targets at greater distances. But all of this assumed targets with radar cross-sections measured in square meters. The thousand-fold reduction in RCS that stealth technology provided overwhelmed these improvements. Soviet attempts to develop stealth aircraft began in the late 1980s, but faced insurmountable obstacles. The faceted design required precision manufacturing capabilities that Soviet aviation industry couldn't achieve consistently. The radar-absorbing materials required advanced chemistry and materials science, where Soviet research lagged American capabilities by decades. The computer systems needed for fly-by-wire control of aerodynamically unstable aircraft required microelectronics that Soviet industry couldn't produce in military-grade quality. Even if Soviet engineers understood the principles, which they did, having studied American research papers and conference presentations, they lacked the industrial capacity to implement those principles in operational aircraft. Post-Gulf War. Soviet military analysis of F-117 performance concluded that their air defense doctrine was obsolete. 40 years of investment in radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and integrated air defenses could be negated by stealth technology they had no ability to counter. Russian attempts to develop stealth aircraft continued through the 1990s and 2000s, eventually producing the T-50, later designated Su-57. This aircraft, introduced in the 2020s, incorporated stealth features, but remained inferior to American designs from the 1980s. Only 14 Su-57s were built as of 2023, compared to over 180 F-22 Raptors and over 1,000 F-35 Lightning IIs in American and Allied service. The F-117 remained operational until 2008, when it was officially retired and replaced by more advanced aircraft including the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II that incorporated stealth from initial design rather than accepting performance compromises. During its 25-year operational career, F-117s flew over 7,300 sorties in Panama, Desert Storm, Kosovo, and the 2003 Iraq invasion. Only one F-117 was ever lost to enemy fire. An aircraft shot down over Serbia in 1999 when the bomb bay doors were opened during weapons release, temporarily increasing the radar cross-section to detectable levels. Even this single loss required extraordinary luck. The Serbian SAM battery commander kept his radar off until the last possible moment, detected the aircraft during the brief vulnerability window, and launched missiles that achieved a proximity kill. Serbia recovered the wreckage and sold access to Chinese and Russian engineers, who studied the stealth technology intently. But studying didn't equal replicating. The faceted design, radar-absorbing materials, and precision manufacturing required remained beyond their industrial capabilities. By the time Russia developed semi-functional stealth technology, in the Su-57 American fifth-generation fighters, like the F-22 and F-35, had incorporated far more sophisticated stealth features, including internal weapons, carriage-advanced ram coatings, and designs optimized for all-aspect stealth, rather than just frontal RCS reduction. The psychological impact on Iraqi air defense personnel was profound and lasting. Crews who had trained for years on Soviet systems, who believed in the effectiveness of their radars and missiles, experienced the trauma of fighting an enemy they couldn't see. They heard aircraft overhead. They saw explosions. They knew they were being attacked. But their equipment, designed and built by Soviet engineers who promised it could detect any airborne threat, showed empty skies. The confidence that had characterized Iraqi air defense before Desert Storm never recovered. Post-war assessments revealed that many air defense crews abandoned their positions in later phases of the war, unwilling to remain at posts where they felt helpless against invisible attackers. The broader strategic implications extended beyond Iraq. Every nation that had purchased Soviet air defense systems, and this included most Soviet clients and allies worldwide, understood that their defensive investments had been made obsolete. Syria, Libya, North Korea, and others operating Soviet SAM systems recognized that those systems couldn't defend against American stealth aircraft. This realization influenced military planning and procurement decisions for decades. Nations either purchased expensive upgrades, attempting to detect stealth aircraft, or accepted that their air defenses couldn't protect against American air power. The stealth revolution that F-117 pioneered became standard for military aviation. All fifth-generation fighter aircraft, American F-22 and F-35, Chinese J-20, Russian Su-57, incorporated stealth design from the beginning rather than as an afterthought. Bombers like the B-2 Spirit and B-21 Raider used stealth as their primary defensive system. Even non-stealthy aircraft received radar signature reduction treatments. The assumption that radar would provide reliable detection and tracking, fundamental to air defense doctrine for 50 years, no longer held. The F-117 had proven that an aircraft could be essentially invisible to radar, and that invisibility conveyed overwhelming tactical advantages. In the cold mathematics of aerial warfare, where detection range and engagement time determine survival, the angular black shape of the F-117 Nighthawk represented more than just clever engineering. It represented the obsolescence of an entire generation of air defense systems, the collapse of Soviet air defense doctrine that had dominated military thinking for decades, and the emergence of a new form of warfare where invisibility mattered more than speed or altitude or maneuverability. Soviet air defense doctrine was perfected to defeat 1970s strike aircraft, flying predictable profiles at detectable altitudes. The F-117 was an invisible bomber from 1990, deployed in 1983. For 25 years, from 1983 until 2008, radar screens showed empty skies, while American bombs fell on targets worldwide. The revolution wasn't just stealth technology, it was making 40 years of Soviet air defense investment irrelevant overnight, demonstrating that American innovation could render entire categories of Soviet military capability worthless through technology that Soviet industry could not match or counter.